On a hot Tuesday afternoon in a small southern town, a 42-year-old black man was driving home from a long day at the office. The sun beat down on his car as he cruised along the familiar streets, windows rolled down to catch what little breeze there was. He was thinking about getting home to his family, maybe grabbing dinner, when he noticed the flashing lights in his rearview mirror. His heart sank a little, but he remained calm. He had been through this before. He carefully signaled and pulled over to the shoulder of the road, making sure to keep his hands visible on the steering wheel. As the officer approached his window, he took a deep breath and prepared himself mentally. Years of experience had taught him how to handle these situations safely. The officer walked up to his car, sunglasses reflecting the afternoon sun. "License?" "And registration," the officer demanded, his tone already sharp. The driver reached slowly for his glove compartment, announcing each movement clearly. "I'm reaching for my registration now, officer." His hands moved deliberately, making sure there was no sudden movement that could be misinterpreted. He handed over his documents with a slight nod. "Good afternoon, officer. May I ask why I was pulled over?" His voice was polite, respectful, exactly what he had learned would help keep things calm. The officer barely glanced at the paperwork before his demeanor changed. "You were speeding back there," he accused, though he had been careful to watch his speed as always. "And your car matches a description we got earlier." "I'm sorry, officer, but I believe there must be some mistake. I was keeping within the speed limit, and I haven't been anywhere unusual today. Just coming home from work." He kept his tone even, trying not to sound defensive. But something in the officer's eyes had already shifted. Maybe it was the neighborhood they were in. Maybe it was something else entirely, but the atmosphere grew tense. "Step out of the vehicle," the officer commanded. "May I ask why, sir?" He knew his rights, but he also knew how quickly things could escalate. "Just step out of the car." The officer's voice was louder now, more aggressive. Other drivers began to slow down, some even pulling over to watch the scene unfold. He complied, moving slowly and keeping his hands where they could be seen. Once out of the car, the officer began questioning him more intensely. "Where are you coming from? Where? Are you going? What's in your pockets?" "I'm coming from work, going home to my family. I have my work identification in my wallet if you'd like to see it." He offered to show proof, hoping it might help clear things up. But the officer's mind seemed already made up. "I need to search your vehicle," he announced, though no probable cause had been established. "Officer, I respectfully ask if you have a warrant or probable cause for the search." He tried to keep his voice calm, even as his heart raced. This only seemed to anger the officer more. "Don't you tell me what I can and can't do." The officer moved to search the car anyway, going through the glove compartment, under the seats, in the trunk. Other motorists continued to slow down, some even stopping to film the interaction with their phones. After an extensive search that yielded nothing suspicious, the officer returned to him with a handful of citation papers. "Here's your speeding ticket, failure to properly signal and improper lane usage." He was stunned. He had been driving carefully as he always did. 3 tickets for actions he hadn't committed. "Officer, I respectfully disagree with these citations. My driving record will show I'm a careful driver." He tried once more to reason with him. "Tell it to the judge," the officer replied dismissively, handing over the tickets and his documents. "Have a nice day." As the officer walked back to his patrol car, the driver stood there, tickets in hand, wondering how a simple drive home had turned into this. He got back in his car, hand still slightly shaking from the adrenaline, and continued his journey home, knowing he would have to deal with this injustice in court. The whole interaction had lasted only 15 minutes, but it felt like hours. 3 tickets that would cost hundreds of dollars to pay, or require him to take time off work to fight in court. It was the kind of situation that made him tired, not physically, but deep in his soul. Another day, another reminder that even when you do everything right, sometimes it's not enough. The following week, he stood in front of the bathroom mirror at 6 a.m., adjusting his tie one more time. Dark circles under his eyes showed he hadn't slept much the night before. He'd been working late on a major case at the office, poring over documents until well past midnight. But today was his court appearance, and he couldn't miss it, no matter how exhausted he felt. He chose his most professional outfit, a crisp white shirt, dark suit, and conservative tie. His shoes were polished to a shine and his hair was neatly trimmed. If there was one thing he'd learned over the years, it was that appearance mattered in courtrooms, especially for someone who looked like him. Every detail had to be perfect. The courthouse was busy that morning with people rushing past him in all directions. He checked in at the front desk and found a seat in the waiting area. The hard plastic chair did nothing for his already sore back, but he sat there quietly, reviewing his notes and the traffic citations one more time. Around him, other people waited for their cases too, some looking nervous, others frustrated, a few sleeping. When his name was finally called, he walked into the courtroom with measured steps. The room smelled like old wood and coffee, with fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Judge Harrison sat at the bench, his black robe making him look imposing against the wood paneling. The judge was already looking through some papers, his reading glasses perched on his nose. "Your Honor," he began, standing at the defendant's table. "I'm here regarding the traffic citations issued last Tuesday." The judge barely looked up. "Approach the bench and state your case." He walked forward, holding his copies of the tickets. His shoulders felt heavy with fatigue, and his voice was softer than usual. "Your Honor, I believe there's been a mistake with these citations. I have a clean driving record for over 15 years. Speak up," the judge interrupted, finally looking at him. But the glance was quick, dismissive. "And stand up straight. This is a court of law." He straightened his posture, though his back protested. "Yes, Your Honor. As I was saying, my driving record shows no violations." "Are you being defiant with me, young man?" The judge's voice rose, causing several people in the gallery to look up. "Your attitude suggests you don't respect this court." He blinked, confused. He had been nothing but polite. "I apologize, Your Honor. I meant no disrespect. I'm simply trying to explain." "There you go again." The judge slammed his gavel. "Looking down, mumbling, acting like you don't want to be here. Is this how you show respect for the law?" The fatigue was making it hard to process what was happening. He tried to speak clearly, looking directly at the judge. "Your Honor, I absolutely respect this court. I work in law enforcement myself, and I understand the importance of—" "Don't you lecture me about law enforcement." The judge's face was reddening now. "I've been on this bench for 20 years. I know defiance when I see it." Other people in the courtroom were starting to whisper among themselves. A court reporter typed rapidly, trying to capture every word. He could feel sweat forming on his forehead despite the air conditioning. "Your Honor, please," he tried again, his voice steady despite his growing anxiety. "I simply want to present my clean driving record and explain why I believe these citations were issued in error." The judge waved his hand dismissively. "Save your excuses, I've heard them all before. Young people today think they can come into my courtroom with their attitudes and their lawyer's tricks. I'm not a lawyer, Your Honor. I'm just representing myself." He stopped himself before saying more, sensing that every word was somehow making things worse. The judge's assistant sitting nearby looked uncomfortable, glancing between the judge and the defendant. Other court officers seemed equally uneasy with how things were progressing. The atmosphere in the room had shifted from routine to tense, with everyone sensing that something wasn't right about this interaction. "Don't interrupt me when I'm speaking," the judge continued, his voice echoing off the walls. "This dismissive attitude of yours shows exactly why you probably deserved those tickets in the first place. People who can't show proper respect in court probably can't follow traffic laws either." He stood there, unsure what to say next. Every attempt to explain himself had been twisted into disrespect. His exhaustion was making it hard to think clearly, and he could feel the situation spiraling beyond his control. The irony wasn't lost on him. He spent his days in courtrooms like this one, but now he felt like a stranger in his own profession. He reached into his briefcase, pulling out a manila folder. Inside were 15 years of clean driving records. Not a single violation, not even a warning. He had spent his lunch break the day before organizing everything, making copies, highlighting the important parts. This documentation would surely clear up the misunderstanding. "Your Honor, I'd like to submit this evidence," he said, holding up the folder. "It shows my clean driving record dating back to—" "Put that down." The judge's voice boomed through the courtroom. "Don't wave papers at me, son." Several people in the gallery turned to look. A woman in the front row whispered something to her companion. The court reporter paused her typing, looking between him and the judge with raised eyebrows. He lowered the folder respectfully. "I apologize, Your Honor. I simply wanted to present these documents for your review. They clearly show that I've never had a traffic violation." "I don't need you telling me what's clear and what isn't," the judge interrupted again. "Your whole demeanor is telling me everything I need to know right now. But, Your Honor, if you could just look at— Are you arguing with me?" The judge leaned forward, his face growing redder. "Because it sounds like you're arguing with me." The defense attorney at the next table glanced over nervously. Even the court officers near the door seemed uncomfortable. One of them shifted his weight from foot to foot, clearly sensing the unusual tension. "No, Your Honor, I'm not arguing. I'm just trying to—" There it is again. That tone. That attitude. The judge pointed his gavel at him. "You stand there in my courtroom, looking at your feet, speaking in that condescending voice, acting like you're better than this process." He had been looking at the judge, not his feet. He had been speaking respectfully. But now he felt like he was in some kind of alternate reality where everything he did was wrong. "Your Honor, please. These documents—" He tried to hand them to the bailiff to pass to the judge. I said, "Put those papers away." The judge's face was now fully flushed. "I've been practicing law longer than you've been alive, and I know a troublemaker when I see one." The court reporter stopped typing altogether, her hands frozen above the keys. The woman in the front row was now openly staring, her mouth slightly open in disbelief. Even the clock on the wall seemed to tick louder in the heavy silence. "I understand, Your Honor," he said quietly, his energy depleting. "I just thought the evidence might be helpful." "Don't you understand me?" The judge slammed his hand on the bench. "I'm sick of this new generation thinking they can waltz into courtrooms with their fancy folders and their educated words, thinking they can outsmart the system." He hadn't used any fancy words. He had barely completed a sentence without being interrupted. The exhaustion from his late night was now mixing with a growing sense of confusion and frustration. "Your Honor, my name is—" He tried one more time to introduce himself properly, hoping that would help reset the conversation. "I don't care what your name is, I care about respect. And you, son, are showing me none." The other attorneys in the room were now openly watching. One prosecutor he recognized from other courtrooms raised his eyebrows in surprise. Even the janitor, who had entered to empty a trash can, paused his work to observe the unusual scene. "But I am being respectful," he said, his voice barely above a whisper now. "Don't you tell me what's respectful." The judge was practically shouting. "Standing there with your arms crossed, your head held high like you own the place. Who do you think you are?" His arms weren't crossed, they were holding his documentation. His head wasn't held high. He was just looking at the judge as he had been taught to do in court. The bailiff near the judge's bench looked at the floor, clearly uncomfortable. The court reporter resumed typing, her fingers flying across the keys. People were pulling out their phones, trying to discreetly record what was happening. "Your Honor," he said one final time, his voice steady despite everything. "I have great respect for this court and for the law. These documents simply show that I've never had a traffic violation before. I'm asking for the chance to present my case fairly." The judge stared at him for a long moment, his breathing heavy. The courtroom had gone completely silent. Everyone was watching, waiting to see what would happen next. The tension was so thick you could almost cut it with a knife. "Well, we'll see about fair," the judge finally said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "We'll see what kind of fair treatment you get." Without even glancing at the manila folder still clutched in his hands, the judge made his decision. He shuffled some papers on his desk, looked over his glasses, and delivered his verdict like he was reading from a script he'd memorized years ago. "Based on what I've seen here today," the judge announced, his voice carrying easily through the now silent courtroom, "you are hereby fined $2,500. The number hit him like a punch. $2,500? For traffic tickets that usually cost a few hundred at most? He opened his mouth to speak, but caught himself, sensing that any word might make things worse. "Furthermore," the judge continued, clearly enjoying this moment, "you will complete 60 hours of community service." Gasps echoed through the gallery. Someone behind him whispered, "That's crazy." Even the prosecutor at the adjacent table looked shocked, raising an eyebrow and exchanging a glance with his colleague. "Your Honor," he managed to say, his voice steady despite his racing heart, "this seems excessive for simple traffic violations." "Seems excessive?" The judge's voice rose, sharply. "You think justice is excessive? You think the law should bend to your convenience?" The court reporter's fingers flew across her machine, struggling to keep up with the rapid exchange. In the gallery, several people had now pulled out their phones, some pretending to check the time while actually hitting record buttons. "Let me tell you something," the judge said, leaning back in his chair as if settling in for a story. "People like you come into my courtroom every day, people who think they're above the law, who think their little folders and their smooth talking can get them out of trouble." He wasn't smooth talking. He had barely been allowed to finish a sentence. But he remained silent, knowing that arguing would only fuel the fire. "You need to learn respect," the judge continued, pointing his gavel in his direction. "Respect for authority, respect for the badge, respect for the bench." The silence in the room was deafening. Even the usual sounds of shuffling papers and quiet conversations had stopped. Everyone was watching this spectacle unfold. "And let me tell you one more thing," the judge said, his voice dropping to a more ominous tone. "You should count yourself lucky. Very lucky. If I had my way, you'd be looking at jail time right now." The threat hung in the air like smoke. He felt his hands tremble slightly but kept them still at his sides. Behind him, he heard someone's phone buzz softly. The court officer near the door shifted uncomfortably. As the judge continued his lecture, he slowly reached into his pocket. His phone was already there, and he had opened the voice recorder app earlier, almost by instinct. Now, he quietly pressed the record button, holding the phone against his leg so no one would notice. The little red dot appeared on his screen, confirming it was capturing every word. "People like you," the judge was saying, waving his hand in the air. "You come from backgrounds that don't teach proper respect. You think because you wear a suit and carry a briefcase that makes you somebody special." The recording app showed sound waves dancing across his screen as it captured the judge's words. He kept his face neutral, though inside he was both angry and amazed at what was happening. "Jail time costs taxpayers money," the judge continued, seeming to enjoy his monologue. "But community service, that teaches lessons, that builds character. You'll be cleaning parks, working in soup kitchens, doing the kind of honest work that might teach you some humility. 60 hours. At this rate, it would take him 3 months of weekends to complete, assuming he could even fit it into his work schedule. $2,500 would empty his savings account. "Pay the fine at the clerk's office downstairs," the judge instructed. "Report to the community service coordinator by next Friday. Miss either deadline, and we'll issue a warrant for your arrest." The finality in the judge's voice told him this was over. No more arguments, no more explanations, just harsh judgment based on assumptions and bias, captured now forever on his phone's recorder. "Do you understand these terms?" the judge asked, raising his voice slightly. "Yes, Your Honor," he replied, his voice barely audible. "I can't hear you." "Yes, Your Honor," he repeated louder this time. "I understand." "Good. Next case." With that dismissal, he turned to gather his papers and his unused evidence. The manila folder that had held all his proof of good driving felt heavy in his hands. As he walked toward the door, he could feel every eye in the room following him. The recording on his phone continued, capturing the sounds of the next case being called, the murmur of voices, the shuffle of feet. Outside the courtroom, He finally stopped the recording. 15 minutes and 42 seconds of audio that documented something extraordinary, a judge's unchecked bias delivered with authority and finality. He saved it with today's date and put the phone back in his pocket, unsure yet what he would do with it, but knowing instinctively that this moment needed to be preserved. As he stood up from the defendant's table, gathering his papers with trembling hands, his briefcase slipped from his grasp. It hit the floor with a soft thud and several items scattered across the worn wooden floor. Pens, his wallet, a small notebook, and his work ID badge. The badge skittered across the floor like a hockey puck, coming to rest near the court clerk's desk. He knelt down to collect his belongings, his back still sore from the uncomfortable chairs and the stress of the hearing. His hands moved quickly, scooping up pens and loose papers, trying to leave the courtroom as quickly as possible. The weight of the judge's harsh sentence sat heavy on his shoulders, and all he wanted was to get out of there. A court clerk, a middle-aged Latina woman who had been quietly organizing files during the hearing, bent down to help. "Here, let me get that for you," she said kindly, reaching for the badge that had slid furthest away. As she picked it up, her eyes automatically focused on the text. She was used to seeing driver's licenses, business cards, and various IDs in this job, but what she saw made her freeze completely. Her hand holding the badge seemed to lock in place, and her other hand stopped mid-reach for a pen. "Oh my God," she whispered, so quietly only she could hear it. The badge was official-looking, deep blue with gold lettering. It read, U.S. Attorney's Office, Southern District. Below that, a name was printed in bold letters, followed by J.D. Senior Federal Prosecutor. There was even an official Department of Justice seal in the corner. She glanced up at the man, who was still gathering his papers, then back down at the badge in her hand. Her mouth opened slightly in shock. This couldn't be real. The man who had just been fined and sentenced to community service, the man the judge had berated for disrespect and attitude, was a federal prosecutor. Is this yours?" she asked, her voice uncertain. He looked up and saw his badge in her hand. "Yes, thank you," he said softly, reaching for it. "I didn't realize it had fallen out." She handed it to him, but her mind was racing. She had worked in this courthouse for 12 years, had seen Judge Harrison in action hundreds of times, but she had never seen anything quite like what had just happened. And now, with this badge in mind, everything suddenly made sense, and also made everything much worse. As he slipped the badge back into his briefcase and stood to leave, she remained at her desk, visibly shaken. She looked around the courtroom, noticing that a few other people had also seen the exchange. The court reporter was giving her a questioning look. Even one of the attorneys who had been waiting for the next case was watching with interest. She couldn't just let this go. This was too big, too important. She turned to her supervisor, who was sorting files nearby. "Mrs. Rodriguez," she called, softly, trying not to attract too much attention. "Could you come here for a moment?" Her supervisor, an older woman who had been running court operations for over 2 decades, walked over. "What is it? You look like you've seen a ghost." The clerk leaned in close, speaking in a whisper. "That man who was just here? The one Judge Harrison fined $2,500 and gave community service to?" "Yes. What about him?" "He's a federal prosecutor, a senior federal prosecutor with the U.S. Attorney's Office." Mrs. Rodriguez's face went pale. She glanced toward the door where the man had exited, then back at her clerk. "Are you sure?" "I saw his badge. Official Department of Justice ID, Southern District, Senior Prosecutor." For a moment they just stared at each other, the implications sinking in. Mrs. Rodriguez had seen her share of courtroom drama over the years, but this was different. This was potentially catastrophic. "We need to tell him," she said finally. "We need to tell Judge Harrison right now." She hurried to the judge's assistant, a young man who was organizing papers at a desk near the chamber's door. The assistant, who had also witnessed the unusual proceedings, looked up as she approached. "We have a situation," Mrs. Rodriguez said quietly but urgently. "A big situation." "What kind of situation?" "The defendant who was just here. The one the judge fined and gave community service to? Yeah, what about him? Mrs. Rodriguez took a deep breath. He's a federal prosecutor, senior level, Department of Justice. The assistant's pen clattered to his desk. His face showed the same shock that had rippled through the courthouse staff. He stood up immediately, knocking his chair back slightly. The judge needs to know, he said, his voice tight with concern. He needs to know right now. The assistant knocked on the chamber door. 2 quick raps that signaled urgency. From inside, they could hear Judge Harrison's voice calling, "Come in." As the assistant disappeared into the chambers, the court clerk and her supervisor exchanged worried glances. They both knew that what had just happened in this courtroom would have consequences far beyond a simple traffic violation case. The badge that had fallen to the floor had revealed a truth that would change everything. The news spread through the courthouse like wildfire. Within minutes, the first whispers began. A bailiff heard it from the court clerk and mentioned it to another officer by the water cooler. The court reporter told the stenographer next door. By the time the assistant knocked on Judge Harrison's chamber door, at least a dozen courthouse employees knew what had just happened. Inside his chambers, Judge Harrison was already removing his robe. The day had been long, and he was looking forward to getting home. He had handled the morning's cases with what he considered his usual authority, sending clear messages to defendants about respect and consequences. When his assistant knocked, he called out, "Come in," without looking up. "Judge, we have a problem," the assistant said, his voice noticeably strained. "What kind of problem?" The judge continued hanging up his robe, still not turning around. "It's about the defendant you just sentenced. The traffic violation case." "What about him?" The judge finally turned, seeing his assistant's pale face. "Did he cause trouble leaving the courtroom?" "No, sir, it's who he is." Judge Harrison's expression shifted from mild irritation to confusion. "Who he is? What are you talking about?" The assistant took a deep breath. His work badge fell out of his briefcase. The court clerk saw it. "He's a federal prosecutor, Judge. Senior level. Department of Justice, Southern District." The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Judge Harrison's face, which had been flushed with authority just minutes ago, now drained of all color. His legs seemed to weaken, and he reached for the edge of his desk for support. "What did you say?" His voice came out as barely a whisper. "He's a federal prosecutor, sir. The clerk said it was official Department of Justice identification. Southern District, senior prosecutor." Judge Harrison sank into his chair, his mind racing through the implications. The Southern District overlapped with his jurisdiction. Federal prosecutors had the power to review cases, to recommend sanctions, to influence judicial appointments and reappointments. His entire career suddenly flashed before his eyes. But he didn't say anything. The judge stammered. "Why? Didn't he identify himself?" "I don't know, sir. Maybe he was trying to handle it like any regular citizen. Maybe he wanted to see if justice would be fairly applied." The judge's breathing became rapid and shallow. $2,500, 60 hours of community service, the lecture about respect and attitude, the threat of jail time, all directed at someone who spent his days prosecuting criminal cases, who knew every law and procedure, who regularly appeared before judges throughout the district. "Oh, God," he muttered, putting his head in his hands. "Oh, my God." His assistant remained standing, watching as his boss processed the magnitude of the situation. The judge's reputation, which he had spent 20 years building, could be destroyed by this morning's decision. Federal prosecutors talked to each other, they talked to other judges. Word would spread beyond this courthouse, beyond this district. "Sir, what do we do?" the assistant asked quietly. Judge Harrison looked up, his eyes now showing the panic he felt. Can we reverse the decision? Recall him?" "He's probably left the building by now." "And sir, there were witnesses. The court reporter, other attorneys, people in the gallery. Some were recording with their phones." "Recording?" The judge's voice cracked slightly. "How do you know they were recording?" "I saw them, sir. After you made the sentencing announcement, several people pulled out their phones. They might have captured the entire proceeding. The implications kept piling up. Video evidence of how He had treated a federal prosecutor. Audio recordings of his condescending remarks, his interruptions, his refusal to look at documentation. All of it now existing in digital form, ready to be shared, reviewed, analyzed. What was his name? The judge asked suddenly. What was the name on his badge? The assistant shifted uncomfortably. I didn't see it personally, sir. The clerk just said it was a Southern District prosecutor, senior level. Judge Harrison stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. Through the blinds, he could see the parking lot where the prosecutor had probably already reached his car. 20 years on the bench, and he had never made a mistake this catastrophic. We need to find out his name, he said, his voice gaining some urgency. We need to contact him immediately. This whole thing needs to be resolved. How do we resolve something like this, sir? The judge turned from the window and his assistant saw something he had never seen before. Genuine fear in Judge Harrison's eyes. Not the controlled authority he usually displayed, not the mild irritation with difficult defendants, but actual fear about the consequences of his actions. I don't know, he admitted quietly. But we better figure it out quickly. Because if this gets out to the Judicial Review Board, if it reaches the media... He let the sentence hang unfinished. Both men stood in the chamber, surrounded by law, books and certificates of achievement, suddenly aware that everything could change based on what happened in this room in the next few hours. The phone on the judge's desk seemed to loom larger than usual, as if waiting for the call that would either save his career or end it. Judge Harrison grabbed his phone with trembling hands. Find his number, he told his assistant urgently. Check. The court records, the paperwork, anything. I need to reach him immediately. The assistant scrambled through the files on his desk, locating the traffic citation case number and pulling up the defendant information. Here it is, sir. Should I call him for you? No, the judge said, already dialing. I'll do it myself. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Each ring felt like an eternity. Finally, a voice answered, calm and professional. Hello? Judge Harrison cleared his throat, trying to compose himself. Yes, hello. This is Judge Harrison from the municipal courthouse. We had a bit of a misunderstanding in court this morning, and I wanted to invite you back to my chambers to discuss it properly. There was a pause on the other end. I'm sorry, Your Honor, but I'm not sure I understand. The case seemed to be concluded. Well, that's just it, the judge said, his voice taking on an artificially friendly tone that sounded completely different from his courtroom demeanor. I realized we may have rushed through things a bit. I'd like to give your documentation a proper review. Perhaps we can work something out that's more appropriate. Another pause. I see. When would you like me to come back? Now would be perfect. If you're still in the area, it won't take long at all. 20 minutes later, there was a knock on the chamber's door. Come in, the judge called, this time rising from his chair to greet his visitor. The transformation was remarkable. The stern, authoritative judge was now all smiles and concern. Please, have a seat. Judge Harrison gestured to a comfortable chair across from his desk. Thank you for coming back so quickly. I hope I didn't interrupt anything important at your office. The prosecutor sat down, his expression neutral. Unknown to the judge, his phone was already in his pocket, recording audio from the moment he entered the room. Now, the judge continued, nervously adjusting papers on his desk, I realize we may have gotten off to a bit of a rough start this morning. Sometimes these courtrooms can be, well, they can be intimidating places, can't they? They can be, Your Honor. Exactly. And you know, traffic court can be particularly challenging. So many cases, so little time. Sometimes we judges, we move too quickly. Don't give proper consideration to each individual situation. The judge paused, waiting for some acknowledgement, but got only a polite nod in response. What I wanted to say, Judge Harrison continued, his voice becoming even more conciliatory, is that I've reviewed the circumstances again, and I think we should reconsider the penalty. $2,500 seems excessive, doesn't it? It did seem high for traffic violations, Your Honor. Yes, exactly. You see, that's exactly right. And the community service hours? 60 hours? That's practically a part-time job. Completely unreasonable for someone with anyone's professional obligations. The judge leaned back in his chair, trying to appear relaxed. What I'm thinking is we reduce that fine to, say, $50, just enough to cover court costs, and maybe 5 hours of community service instead of 60. Does that sound more reasonable? That's quite a change from the earlier ruling, Your Honor. Well, you know. The judge attempted a laugh, though. It came out nervous and forced. Even judges make mistakes. We're human, too. The important thing is correcting those mistakes, don't you think? The prosecutor remained silent, his hands folded in his lap, his phone capturing every word of this. Backpedaling. In fact, Judge Harrison continued, leaning forward conspiratorially, since this whole thing seems to have been based on some misunderstandings, maybe we just forget the whole thing? Start fresh. Clean slate. No fines. No community service. We treat it like it never happened. You're suggesting dismissing the case entirely? I'm suggesting, the judge said carefully, that sometimes the best way to handle these situations is to acknowledge that mistakes happen on all sides and move forward. No harm, no foul, as they say. And what about the court records? The transcript from this morning's hearing? The judge's smile faltered slightly. Well, those can be adjusted. Things get misreported all the time. My court reporter, she's very understanding about these administrative errors. The silence in the room was heavy. The prosecutor adjusted his position slightly, ensuring his phone had a clear line to the conversation. That's very generous of you, Your Honor, he said finally. But I'm curious about something. What changed between this morning's hearing and now? Judge Harrison shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Nothing really changed. I had time to reflect, to consider things more carefully. You know how it is when we're rushing through cases. Sometimes we don't see the full picture right away. The full picture? Yes, exactly. The full picture. The context. The circumstances. The person involved. The judge was clearly struggling now, his attempts at casualness becoming more forced. Sometimes we make judgments too quickly, based on incomplete information. The prosecutor nodded slowly. I appreciate you taking the time to reconsider, Your Honor. It's not often someone in authority admits they might have made an error. Oh well. The judge waved his hand dismissively. Like I said, we're all human. The important thing is doing the right thing now, wouldn't you agree? Absolutely. The right thing is very important. Judge Harrison relaxed slightly, mistaking the prosecutor's agreement for acceptance. Wonderful. So we're in agreement then. We'll dismiss the charges, forget this whole unfortunate misunderstanding, and everything goes back to normal. The prosecutor was quiet for a moment, and in that silence the audio recorder captured the tick of the office clock, the distant sounds of the courthouse, and the barely audible sound of Judge Harrison's nervous breathing. Let me think about it, Your Honor, he said finally. This is all quite sudden. Perhaps I could get back to you tomorrow? The judge's carefully constructed composure cracked just a little. Tomorrow? Well, I suppose. Yes, tomorrow would be fine, just fine. That evening, he sat at his kitchen table, laptop open, with a cup of cold coffee beside him. The day's events replayed in his mind like a broken record. His wife had already gone to bed, but he couldn't sleep yet. He knew what he had to do, even though it meant potentially creating waves in the legal community where he worked. The audio recordings were clear and damning. He listened to them one more time, hearing the judge's hostile tone in the morning, then the complete reversal in his chambers. The contrast was stark enough to make anyone uncomfortable. But he also heard something else. The unmistakable pattern of bias that he'd seen too many times before. He opened the State Judicial Review Board's website and began filling out the formal misconduct complaint form. Each field required careful attention: date, time, case number, witnesses present. He typed methodically, making sure every detail was accurate. By midnight, he had drafted a comprehensive complaint, attaching audio files and documenting every interaction in chronological order. The next morning at work, he mentioned the incident to a colleague, a defense attorney who had practiced in the same district for years. Her reaction surprised him. "Wait, Judge Harrison?" she said, putting down her coffee. "You're not the first person I've heard this about." "What do you mean?" "There have been rumors for years, mostly whispered conversations in the lawyer's lounge. Several black clients have complained about his treatment in court, but no one ever filed anything official." She leaned in closer, lowering her voice. "I represented a client last month. Similar situation. Perfectly polite young man, minor traffic violation, but the judge was incredibly harsh. My client said he felt targeted because of his race. I managed to get the sentence reduced on appeal, but by lunch, word had spread through the legal community. 3 more attorneys approached him privately, each with similar stories. One described how her client had been fined triple the normal amount for a first-time offense. Another recounted a case where the judge had refused to accept character references from a black defendant. "I've kept notes," the third attorney said, pulling out a worn notebook. 5 cases in 2 years where the sentencing seemed disproportionate. All young black men. All similar circumstances to yours. That afternoon, he received a call from the chief of staff at a neighboring law office. "I heard about your complaint," she said. "We have a client who's been waiting for someone to go first. She's been scared to file alone, but now..." By the end of the week, what had started as one complaint had grown into a coordinated effort. 7 attorneys had reached out, representing 11 different cases from the past 3 years. Each case showed the same pattern: excessive fines, harsher sentences, and dismissive treatment toward black defendants. The State Judicial Review Board convened an emergency hearing. The evidence was mounting, not just his recordings but sworn statements from other attorneys, transcripts showing sentencing disparities, and a pattern that was impossible to ignore. During his interview with the board, he played the audio recordings. The panel of 5 judges listened in silence as they heard Judge Harrison's morning tirade, followed by his panicked chambers meeting. One panel member visibly winced at the backpedaling and the offers to forget the whole thing. "And this pattern of behavior?" the panel chair asked. "You've documented similar incidents from other defendants?" "Yes, ma'am. The complaint includes supporting documentation from 11 cases over 3 years. Each shows significant sentencing disparities compared to similar cases involving white defendants. The investigation expanded rapidly. Court transcripts were reviewed, sentencing records compared, and patterns emerged that painted a troubling picture. The Judicial Review Board discovered that Judge Harrison's average fine for black defendants was 40% higher than for white defendants in similar cases. Local news outlets picked up the story when the investigation became public record. "Federal prosecutor exposes judicial bias" ran as a headline, though he tried to keep the focus on systemic issues rather than his own experience. More people came forward, not lawyers this time, but everyday citizens who had appeared before. Judge Harrison. Their stories were heartbreakingly similar: interrupted explanations, dismissive attitudes, excessive penalties, and a courtroom atmosphere that felt hostile from the moment they walked in. The evidence became overwhelming. Audio recordings, witness statements, statistical analysis of sentencing patterns, and documented complaints stretching back years. What had started as one person standing up for fair treatment had uncovered a pattern of bias that affected countless community members. 3 months later, the Judicial Review Board concluded their investigation. Their findings confirmed what many had suspected, but no one had been able to prove. Judge Harrison had demonstrated a clear pattern of discriminatory behavior that violated judicial ethics and undermined public trust in the legal system. The complaint process, which had begun with one person deciding to speak up, had grown into something larger, a community finding its voice and demanding accountability from those entrusted with dispensing justice fairly and impartially. 3 months after filing the complaint, the disciplinary hearing convened in the E2 state capitol. The modern conference room was filled with tension as Judge Harrison entered, flanked by his attorney. For the first time, he wasn't wearing his black robes or sitting behind an elevated bench. Here he was just another person facing judgment. The panel consisted of 3 senior judges and 2 public representatives. They had spent weeks reviewing evidence, interviewing witnesses, and analyzing court records. The chief panelist shuffled through thick folders as Judge Harrison took his seat at the defendant's table, a position he had never experienced before. "We've reviewed extensive documentation regarding complaints of judicial misconduct," the chief panelist began. "The evidence includes audio recordings, witness testimonies, and statistical analysis of sentencing patterns spanning 3 years. One by one, witnesses took the stand. The court clerk who had first discovered the badge testified about what she observed that day. The assistant who had witnessed the panicked chamber meeting described Judge Harrison's desperate attempts to reverse his decision. Defense attorneys presented their cases, each painting a similar picture of disproportionate treatment. When it was time for Judge Harrison to respond, he stood slowly. His usual commanding presence was gone, replaced by something smaller, more human. I never intended to treat anyone unfairly," he said, his voice barely audible. "The pressures of the courtroom, the volume of cases, I may have acted hastily." The panel wasn't satisfied with vague admissions. They played the audio recordings publicly. Judge Harrison's morning hostility filled the room, followed by his afternoon desperation. Several attendees shifted uncomfortably as they heard the stark contrast between the 2 interactions. "The evidence shows a pattern," the chief panelist stated firmly. "Statistical analysis indicates that your sentencing for black defendants averaged 40% higher than comparable cases involving white defendants. This isn't about isolated incidents or courtroom pressure. This is about systemic bias in your decision-making." Additional evidence emerged during the hearing. Court reporters had kept unofficial notes about Judge Harrison's behavior over the years. Security footage showed his demeanor changing visibly when black defendants approached the bench. The pattern was undeniable. After 2 days of hearings, the panel delivered their decision. Judge Harrison would receive a formal censure, a permanent mark on his judicial record. He would undergo mandatory diversity and implicit bias training, not for a day or a week, but for 6 months. Most significantly, he would be suspended from the bench for 6 months without pay. This suspension serves multiple purposes, the chief panelist explained. It provides time for serious reflection on judicial responsibilities, ensures completion of comprehensive training, and demonstrates that discriminatory behavior has real consequences, regardless of position or tenure. But the story didn't end with Judge Harrison's punishment. The federal prosecutor who had started this journey used his experience as a catalyst for broader change. He began speaking at legal conferences, sharing his story to highlight systemic issues in the justice system. "My case was unusual because I had resources, knowledge, and evidence," he told a gathering of state attorneys. "But how many people face this every day without those advantages? How many simply pay their fines and accept unjust sentences because they don't know their rights or fear retaliation?" His advocacy gained momentum. Legal organizations invited him to testify before state legislative committees about judicial reform. His solution was simple yet powerful: mandatory body cameras in all courtrooms. Transparency protects everyone, he argued. It protects defendants from bias, protects judges from false accusations, and ensures accountability for all parties. If cameras can protect police officers and civilians during traffic stops, why not in courtrooms? Within a year, his home district became the first to implement the body camera program. Judges wore small recording devices during proceedings, with footage automatically preserved and available for review. The program included privacy protections for sensitive cases, while ensuring transparency for routine proceedings. The results were immediate and profound. Complaints about judicial misconduct dropped by 60% in the first year. Judges reported feeling more conscious of their behavior, and defendants expressed greater trust in the fairness of their hearings. Other districts took notice and began implementing similar programs. He also worked with law schools to incorporate implicit bias training into standard judicial education. Mock courtroom exercises helped future judges recognize their own unconscious biases before reaching the bench. 2 years after the incident, He received an award from the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers for his advocacy work. In his acceptance speech, he emphasized that change wasn't just about punishing bad actors. It was about creating systems that prevented bias from taking root. One person's experience of injustice became a community's call for reform, he said. Technology, training, and transparency, these are tools we can use to build a justice system that truly serves justice. Judge Harrison completed his suspension and training. He returned to the bench a changed person, now advocating for the same reforms his case had inspired. The incident that could have been a career-ending scandal became instead a transformation story, both personal and systemic, showing how one moment of documented injustice could spark meaningful change across an entire legal system.